The rain fell in slow, deliberate sheets, drenching the cemetery in an eerie stillness. It was as if the heavens themselves mourned the passing of the great Theodore Langston, a billionaire whose wealth and power had touched nearly every corner of the city. Black umbrellas dotted the funeral procession like ink stains on a gray canvas. The air was thick with grief, or at least with the practiced solemnity of those who had come to pay their respects. Some mourned for the man. Others mourned for their lost opportunities now that he was gone. But none expected the disturbance that would soon shake them all to their core. As the priest uttered the final prayers over the mahogany coffin, a sudden hush spread through the gathered crowd. A girl, drenched from head to toe, stood just beyond the wrought iron gates of the cemetery. Her dress was plain, cheap, and stuck to her frail body like wet rags. Her blonde hair clung to her pale face, and her eyes, wide, sunken, and impossibly dark, held a look that sent a chill down the spine of those who dared to meet her gaze. She was out of place, an aberration against the wealth and status surrounding her. Then she spoke. "I'm his daughter." The words cut through the rain like a blade. A collective gasp rippled through the mourners. Murmurs spread like wildfire. The Langston family, seated at the front, their designer-clad figures standing in rigid shock, turned as one to face the girl. "Well, what did you just say?" Patricia Langston, Theodore's widow, demanded. Her voice wavered between disbelief and outrage. The girl stepped forward, her wet shoes squelching against the muddy ground. "I said, I'm his daughter, and I have proof." A hush settled over the mourners, all eyes fixed on the girl who had just uttered a claim that could unravel everything the Langstons had built. Theodore Langston had been a man of influence, but also a man of secrets. His widow, Patricia, knew better than anyone that he had been far from faithful. Still, this was impossible. "You're lying," she spat, her gloved fingers tightening around the funeral program. Theodore never mentioned a daughter. The girl, who couldn't have been older than 19, tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into something that resembled a smile. But there was no warmth in it. Of course he didn't. He never wanted to acknowledge me. He left me and my mother to rot while he built his empire. A tense silence followed. Even the priest looked uncomfortable. "Who is your mother?" asked Oliver Langston, Theodore's eldest son, his jaw tight. "Her name was Evelyn Clark," the girl said. "She died 3 years ago." Patricia inhaled sharply. That name, it stirred something in the recesses of her mind, something Theodore had once dismissed in passing. A woman from his past, a woman he had paid off to disappear. "If you're really his daughter," Oliver said, voice skeptical, "where's your proof?" The girl reached into the pocket of her soaked dress and pulled out a faded, crumpled photograph. The rain had smudged the edges, but the image was clear. A young Theodore Langston, his arm around a beautiful woman with hauntingly familiar eyes. Eyes that mirrored those of the girl standing before them. "That's my mother," she said. "And that's him before he was rich, before he abandoned us." The crowd murmured again, shifting uncomfortably. The resemblance was undeniable. Patricia's mind reeled. If this girl was telling the truth, everything, the fortune, the inheritance, the carefully crafted legacy of Theodore Langston, could be threatened. "Even if this is true," Patricia snapped, regaining her composure, "what do you expect to gain by showing up here? Money? An apology from the dead?" The girl shook her head. "I don't want your money. I want something else." Oliver narrowed his eyes. "What then?" The girl's expression darkened. "I want to know where he buried her." A cold gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rattling the trees. The funeral attendees shivered, though not from the chill in the air. "Be buried who?" Patricia stammered. The girl exhaled, the weight of her words pressing into the silence. "My mother." Theodore Langston had been buried in a grand family mausoleum, an ornate structure that loomed over the cemetery like a monument to his wealth. But now, the girl's accusation hung in the air like a curse. "You're saying he buried her?" Oliver's voice was cautious. "Not properly," the girl said, her dark eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Not in a way the world would ever know." A chill ran through the crowd. The idea was absurd. Theodore Langston, billionaire, philanthropist, businessman, was being accused of something unspeakable. "That's enough," Patricia snapped, stepping forward. "You've made your scene. You're upsetting the guests. Leave." But the girl stood firm. "I know what he did," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "And I know where he did it." The ground beneath them felt heavier, as though the dead themselves were listening. "Prove it," Oliver said after a long pause. His voice, though laced with skepticism, held a trace of something else. Curiosity. The girl's lips parted in a slow, deliberate smile. "Follow me?" She turned abruptly and walked toward the trees lining the cemetery, her thin frame vanishing into the shadows. Oliver hesitated, but something about the way she spoke, the eerie certainty in her voice, compelled him to follow. Against Patricia's protests, a small group of them, Oliver, his younger sister Amelia, and a few others, trailed behind the girl. The deeper they walked into the cemetery, the more the air thickened. The rain had slowed, but the oppressive silence was suffocating. Then the girl stopped. She pointed to an unmarked patch of earth, its surface uneven, as though it had been disturbed years ago. "He put her here," she whispered. Oliver's stomach twisted. "That's impossible. You weren't even born when he told her. The girl interrupted, turning to face him. "Before he killed her." A collective shudder passed through the group. "This is insane," Amelia whispered. "She has no proof." The girl stepped forward and dug her fingers into the wet soil. "Wait, what are you?" Oliver reached to stop her, but it was too late. Her hands tore through the earth with desperate fury, clawing at the dirt like an animal. Then the ground gave way. A single bone, yellowed with age, jutted from the soil. The screams that followed shattered the night. A single bone jutted out from the disturbed soil, its yellowed surface glistening under the dim, rain-drenched sky. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. Then, as if the weight of the revelation had finally sunk in, Amelia Langston let out a sharp, choked scream. Oliver stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This could be anything. His voice lacked conviction. The girl, still crouched by the shallow grave, slowly turned her head to look up at them. Her expression was unreadable, but her dark eyes gleamed with something chilling. "Dig deeper." "No." Patricia's voice rang through the cemetery, shrill with fury. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this ends now." She reached for Oliver, yanking him back, her fingers digging into his arm. "We are leaving." Oliver resisted, his gaze locked on the fragment of bone protruding from the soil. The realization crept over him in slow, paralyzing waves. His father had secrets, many of them, but murder? No, that was impossible. And yet, the girl didn't move, didn't speak. She simply sat there in the wet mud, hands resting on her knees as though she had all the time in the world. The storm overhead had eased, but a different kind of tension crackled in the air. Amelia's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. "We should call the police." Patricia spun on her daughter. "Absolutely not." Her face, though pale, was set in cold, practiced determination. This is a trick. A lie." The girl tilted her head. "Then prove me wrong," she whispered. Patricia's lip curled. "Oh, I will?" She turned to a nearby security guard, one of the Langston family's personal staff, hired for the funeral. "Get her out of here." The man hesitated, eyes darting between the girl and the exposed remains. "Mrs. Langston, Now," she snapped. The guard took an uneasy step forward, but before he could act, the girl stood. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost unnatural. "You don't want to touch me," she murmured. The way she said it, soft, almost hypnotic, made the air grow impossibly thick. The guard faltered. "Why?" Oliver demanded. His voice wavered, though he tried to mask it. "Why would my father kill your mother?" The girl finally looked at him directly, and when she spoke, her voice was almost reverent, because she knew the truth. A gust of wind howled through the cemetery, rustling the trees, sending icy tendrils of dread creeping into the bones of every person standing there. Oliver swallowed hard. "What truth?" The girl took a slow, measured step toward him. "You think I came here for revenge? For money?" "No." Her lips curved slightly. "I came to warn you." Oliver frowned. Warn us? She exhaled. I thought maybe now that he's dead, I wouldn't have to. But I was wrong. Her gaze flicked past them, toward the grand Langston mausoleum, its shadow stretching long and ominous across the wet grass. He didn't just bury my mother, she whispered. He buried something much worse. The words unsettled everyone. Even Patricia, who had spent years perfecting the art of composure, looked rattled. This is absurd, she snapped. You expect us to believe my husband was some kind of monster? The girl finished for her. She took another step forward, lowering her voice. You already know he was. Patricia's mouth opened, then closed. The truth was, she had known Theodore was cruel, unfaithful, manipulative. But a murderer? No. And yet, as the rain dripped from the trees, mingling with the freshly disturbed earth, a sliver of doubt wormed its way into her chest. Oliver let out a slow, unsteady breath. What exactly do you mean? The girl's gaze flicked toward the mausoleum again. Have you ever been inside? Oliver hesitated. Of course we have, Patricia cut in quickly. It's our family tomb. The girl's lips curled slightly. Then tell me, Mrs. Langston, what's in the lower level? Patricia stiffened. Oliver frowned. What lower level? For a fraction of a second, Patricia's face betrayed something. A flicker of hesitation, of something unspoken. Oliver turned to his mother sharply. Mom? Patricia's jaw clenched. There is no lower level. The girl's eyes gleamed. That's what he wanted you to believe. Oliver looked between the two women, his pulse pounding. What's in there? Patricia exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to regain control. Enough of this. I will not entertain the delusions of some. Let's find out, Oliver said suddenly. Patricia froze. What? Oliver squared his shoulders, turning toward the mausoleum. Let's go inside. Amelia let out a choked sound. Oliver, you can't be serious. Why not? His voice was steely. If she's lying, then this all ends here, right? Patricia opened her mouth to protest, but Oliver was already moving, cutting through the wet grass with determined strides. The others hesitated, fear tightening their throats. Then, slowly, they followed. The girl watched them, silent. Then, as if satisfied, she trailed behind. The Langston Mausoleum was a towering structure, built from cold gray stone and adorned with intricate carvings. Its doors, heavy and ornate, bore the Langston crest, a symbol of power, of wealth. But now, it felt more like a warning. Oliver reached for the handle. It was locked. Patricia, breathless from catching up, hissed, Enough of this nonsense, Oliver. We are leaving now. Oliver turned to her, eyes sharp. Give me the key. Patricia hesitated, gripping her purse tightly. Mom, she didn't move. Then the girl spoke. I can open it. Oliver turned to her. How? The girl simply stepped forward, her hands ghosting over the heavy metal door. Then she pressed her fingers against one of the carvings. An engraving of an owl, its wings spread wide. There was a soft click, a hidden mechanism. Patricia paled. Before she could protest, the doors groaned open, revealing the dark, yawning interior. A rush of cold air spilled out, thick with the scent of stone and something older. Something wrong. Oliver stepped inside. The girl followed. One by one, the others hesitated, then entered. Inside, the walls bore names of ancestors long past, the floor lined with ornate sarcophagi. But the girl ignored them all. She walked straight to the back, to the far wall. And then, without hesitation, she pressed her palm against the stone. Another click. A section of the floor shifted. And then, slowly, painfully, it began to sink. A hidden stairway, leading down. Patricia let out a strangled sound. Stop this. But Oliver was already moving forward. And beneath them, in the dark, unseen depths of the mausoleum, something waited. The hidden stairway gaped open like the maw of some ancient beast, its depths vanishing into inky blackness. A damp, fetid breath rose from below, curling around the gathered mourners like invisible fingers. Oliver swallowed hard. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was insane. This was impossible. And yet, here was a secret beneath his father's tomb. The girl stood motionless beside the opening, her face unreadable. The rain had slowed to a faint drizzle, tapping against the stone walls of the mausoleum. Patricia's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This ends now. We're not going down there." Oliver turned to her sharply. "You knew about this." Patricia's face barely twitched, but that flicker of hesitation told him everything. "How long?" Oliver demanded. "How long have you known there was something beneath this mausoleum?" Patricia's lips parted, but no sound came out. She was a master of control, of deception, but now the walls were crumbling. Amelia's voice was small, uncertain. "Mom, what's down there?" Patricia inhaled sharply, regaining her composure. "Nothing. This is ridiculous." She turned to the girl, venom in her voice. "I don't know what kind of trick you've pulled, but—" "No tricks," the girl murmured. She stepped toward the open stairway and, without another word, began to descend. Oliver hesitated for only a moment before following. "Oliver!" Patricia snapped, but he ignored her. Amelia's breath hitched as she looked at the darkness below. She turned to her mother. "If there's nothing down there, why are you so afraid?" Before Patricia could answer, Amelia gritted her teeth and hurried after her brother. The others, Langston family associates, security guards, distant relatives, remained frozen, watching in tense silence. Patricia exhaled, her body taut with rage. But after a moment, she stepped forward and followed. She had no choice. The air grew colder as they moved downward. The stone steps, slick with moisture, spiraled deep beneath the cemetery. The walls closed in around them, rough and uneven, carved by hands that had long since turned to dust. The girl led the way, her movements slow and deliberate. She carried no flashlight, but somehow she navigated the darkness as if she had walked this path 1,000 times before. Oliver's fingers brushed against the damp walls, his breath uneven. "What is this place?" The girl didn't answer. The further they descended, the heavier the air became. The silence pressed in, not just the absence of sound, but something deeper, an emptiness that clawed at the senses. Then, at last, the staircase ended. They emerged into a vast underground chamber. A single lantern flickered on the wall, casting long, jagged shadows. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something foul. Oliver's stomach twisted as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. The floor was uneven, littered with debris. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling. And at the far end of the chamber, a large, ornate coffin rested against the wall, its lid slightly ajar. But the worst part, the part that made Oliver's breath catch, was the marks. Scratches. Deep, desperate gouges in the stone floor. Claw marks, as though someone had tried to crawl away. Amelia inhaled sharply, covering her mouth. "What the hell is this?" Patricia's face was pale, her breathing shallow. This can't be real." The girl stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where he put them." Oliver turned sharply. "Them?" The girl's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "He didn't just bury my mother." Her voice was calm, almost serene. "There were others." A shudder rippled through the group. Oliver took a step toward the coffin, his throat dry. Who else?" The girl's gaze remained steady. "Women, servants, people who knew too much." She lifted her hand, gesturing toward the scratch marks on the floor. "Some were buried alive." Amelia let out a strangled noise, staggering back. "No, that's insane." But Patricia, silent, stiff, did not deny it. Oliver turned to his mother slowly. His voice was eerily calm. "You knew." Patricia closed her eyes. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of dripping water from the ceiling. Then, thud, a muffled sound, a movement. Oliver's heart seized. He turned sharply toward the coffin. Something shifted inside. Amelia whimpered. "Tell me you heard that." Another thud, a scraping noise. Slow, deliberate, like nails against wood. Oliver's body went cold. "There's no way." Then the lid of the coffin slid open. Amelia screamed. Oliver staggered back, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. From the coffin, a figure sat up, pale, withered, skin stretched thin over brittle bones. But the worst part, the part that sent a primal, suffocating terror surging through Oliver's veins. Its eyes were open, black, sunken voids. Hollow, hungry. The girl remained perfectly still, watching. Oliver's voice barely escaped his throat. That's not possible. But the thing moved. Its bony fingers curled against the edge of the coffin. Its head tilted, jerky and unnatural. A guttural rattle escaped its throat. Then, slowly, it turned toward Patricia. Patricia froze. The air thickened, suffocating. The figure opened its mouth, and in a voice that was not human, not earthly, it spoke. "You thought I was gone?" Patricia's eyes widened. "You buried me." Oliver's blood ran ice cold. Patricia's hands trembled. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The girl took a slow step forward. "This," she whispered, "is what he was afraid of." The thing in the coffin moved again, its skeletal limbs creaking. "You thought I would stay dead." Patricia stumbled back, her face twisted in horror. No, this isn't real. This isn't asterisk." The thing let out a rasping breath, its head jerking toward the others. Its sunken gaze settled on Oliver. "He lied to you?" Oliver's heart pounded. "Who are you?" The figure let out a slow, rotting smile. "You already know." Then, with inhuman speed, it lunged. The corpse moved too fast, a blur of brittle limbs and peeling flesh. Patricia barely had time to scream before the thing was upon her. It slammed her against the stone wall, its withered hands gripping her shoulders with unnatural strength. The scent of rotting meat and damp earth filled the chamber, choking the air. Patricia's scream turned to a strangled wheeze as the thing leaned closer, its gaping mouth far too wide, exposing blackened gums and shattered teeth. "You left me in the dark," it rasped. Its voice was a gurgling whisper, thick with decay and rage. Patricia struggled, her nails raking against its bony wrists, but it did not budge. Oliver reacted instinctively. "Get away from her!" He lunged, grabbing a loose chunk of stone from the ground and slamming it against the thing's skull. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber. The corpse jerked back, releasing Patricia. She collapsed onto the cold floor, gasping for breath. The thing whipped its head around toward Oliver. Its sunken black eyes locked onto him. And for a moment, Oliver felt something primal and cold slither down his spine. It knew him, and it was hungry. Then the girl stepped forward. "Enough!" Her voice, though quiet, rippled through the air with an unnatural weight. The corpse froze. Its head twitched, as if caught between two opposing forces. "You are not finished yet." The girl's words were not a plea. They were command. The thing shuddered, its limbs spasming. Its lips peeled back into a grin that was too wide, too unnatural. It rasped. "You call me back." The girl did not move. "Not me," she whispered. "Him." She lifted a single, trembling hand and pointed directly at Oliver. A terrible silence followed. Then, the corpse lunged at Oliver. Oliver barely had time to react. The thing collided with him, its ice-cold hands wrapping around his throat. The pressure was immediate, merciless, as if it had been waiting years for this moment. Oliver's vision blurred, his lungs screaming for air. Somewhere in the background, Amelia shrieked, Patricia was shouting, but the world was fading. The thing's voice was in his ear now, a whisper made of rotting breath and ancient suffering. "He took everything from me." Oliver clawed at its arms, but it was stronger than it should be, its grip fueled by something far beyond death. "Now I take it back." Then the girl moved. She stepped between them, placing her palm against the corpse's forehead. The moment she touched it, the thing convulsed violently, its grip loosening. It let out a shriek, a sound that wasn't human, a sound that belonged to the depths of the earth. Then it collapsed, its body rotting away before their eyes, crumbling into dust and bone. The chamber went deathly silent. Oliver gasped for breath, collapsing to his knees. His throat burned, bruises already forming. Patricia's breaths were ragged, her hands shaking. Amelia sobbed quietly in the corner. The girl remained still, watching as the last fragments of the corpse turned to nothing. What? Oliver choked out. What the hell was that? The girl slowly turned to face him, and then she said something that made the cold in his bones sink even deeper. That was only the first one. Oliver's head snapped up. The first, he echoed, his pulse thundering. The girl looked past him, toward the far end of the chamber. In the dim, flickering light, the stone wall was shifting. Hairline cracks spread like veins, the surface trembling as if something beneath it was breathing. A low, deep groan rumbled through the cavern, like ancient stone being torn apart. He buried them here, the girl whispered. All of them. A horrible realization dawned on Oliver. The scratches on the floor, the chains hanging from the ceiling, the muffled screams trapped in the walls of his childhood nightmares. His father hadn't just killed one person. He had buried an entire graveyard beneath them. And now, a crack split the wall from ceiling to floor. A foul, rancid stench filled the chamber. Patricia staggered back. No, this isn't possible. But it was happening. The stone splintered, and something pushed through, something black and rotting, with too many fingers and teeth that weren't human anymore. Oliver felt a scream rise in his throat. The dead were coming back, and this time, they would not be stopped. They were waking up. The wall exploded inward, sending shards of ancient stone and dust cascading into the chamber. From within the dark crevice, something slithered out. Many somethings. Limbs, fingers, bodies, half decayed and writhing, pulling themselves free from their tomb. A chorus of whispers filled the cavern, voices layered atop one another, writhing with hatred, betrayal, and agony. You buried us alive. You stole our lives. Now we take yours. Patricia let out a strangled cry, stumbling back toward the stairs. Oliver could barely breathe. The air had thickened, heavy with the stench of rotting flesh and something far worse, something old. Amelia's sobs were choked with terror, her entire body trembling. The girl remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. It's time, she whispered. He must pay. Her eyes snapped to Patricia. You must pay. Patricia froze. Her face was pale, her lips parted in silent horror. No, she gasped. I didn't know. The girl's cold stare cut through her. You knew. The voices grew louder, pressing against the walls of the chamber, the weight of their suffering crushing down on all of them. She helped bury us. She was there when he sealed us in. She heard our screams and did nothing. Oliver turned toward his mother slowly, his breath shallow. He wanted to believe it wasn't true. That Patricia Langston, the woman who had raised him, was innocent. But her silence was the loudest confession of all. The girl raised a single hand. Give her to us. The dead surged forward, crawling over one another, their grotesque forms hungry for justice. Patricia let out a scream of pure terror. Oliver, help me. But Oliver did not move. Amelia turned to him, pleading. We can't just let them take her. Oliver's jaw tightened. Can't we? Patricia's eyes widened. I did what I had to do. Oliver's voice was hollow. So did they. Then, the dead descended upon her. Patricia's screams were inhuman, ripped from the depths of her soul. The shadows consumed her, dragging her down into the darkness of the tomb she had helped create. Her wails echoed long after her body had vanished. Then, the silence returned. Oliver stood motionless, staring at the spot where his mother had been. Amelia was crying, her hands covering her mouth. The dead, the ones that had been trapped for so long, began to fade, their forms dissolving into dust and whispers, one by one. The girl exhaled softly. It's over. Oliver turned to her, his voice raw. Who was she? The one in the coffin? The girl's expression remained unreadable. The first victim. She turned to him fully, stepping closer. She was supposed to be your mother. Oliver's stomach dropped. His entire body went cold. What? The girl tilted her head. She was pregnant. With you. The room spun. But Langston chose Patricia instead, she murmured. He took her place, took her life. Oliver's hands trembled. Everything he had ever known, everything he had ever believed, had been a lie. "Then who are you?" he whispered. The girl's lips curled into a small, sad smile. "Your sister?" Oliver's breath caught in his throat. The world tilted. And then, the lantern flickered out, plunging them into darkness. When Oliver emerged from the tomb, the sky was beginning to brighten with the first hints of dawn. The storm had passed, but the cemetery felt empty, hollow, as if something ancient had been lifted from its depths. Amelia followed behind him, silent and shaken. The girl was gone. Oliver wasn't sure if she had ever truly been there at all. The mausoleum loomed behind him, its doors hanging open, its secrets finally unearthed. Oliver inhaled deeply, his chest tight. Langston was dead. His sins had been buried with him. But Oliver knew, some ghosts never truly rest.